What are the different theories of addiction? We've got the reward deficit theory, which basically says individuals with hypodopaminergic states will seek out substances. There is the impulsivity theory that says it's actually the opposite, where there is excessive activity of the brain's reward system that moves the individuals towards seeking. There is the incentive sensitization theory, which posits that drug addiction, it's the excessive amplification, specifically of psychological wanting, triggered by cues, without amplification of liking. So this is a really important concept. Sensitization is where initially what would have been liking is now reduced liking with amplification of wanting. And we'll see the fourth one, which really brings all of it together, known as the habit learning theory. The evolution of addiction is linked to the transition from liking a substance to wanting and eventually seeking it compulsively, reflecting a shift from conscious reward-driven behaviors to automatic habits. When we think about humans, we know that our systems are brilliant at moving from goal-directed action to habits. So therefore, when primed, with certain circumstances, any of us with the right vulnerabilities, with substances can move from here, this exact sort of goal-directed action to habit-forming aspects. We have the wiring for it. We can move from liking to wanting to seeking. Okay, in fact, the basis of psychodynamic psychotherapy also is about automatized predictions. Mark Solms calls it automatized predictions, which is nothing but the habits that we all have. Some are not ever accessible to the conscious, and that's why they are the true unconscious. They are only seen in patterns of behavior. And in order for those to change, we've got to bring them up to the conscious, to the consciousness, so that we can actually change it, which is exactly the same neurobiologically. Remember, what we're trying to do is to strengthen the prefrontal-striatal circuits, i.e. strengthen cognition, because ultimately it's cortical drive that controls the subcortical aspects. So often I find that the languages in psychodynamic aspects are different, the methods that we use are different, but the principles remain the same. So reward deficit syndrome is a really interesting concept because it's transdiagnostic. Essentially what it says is individuals lie on a spectrum, and there are genes, there are neurobiological aspects and cognitive processes, so endophenotypes. And RDS, this paper is, the paper describes it as an octopus. Eating disorders, substance use, ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorder, OCD, impulse dysregulation disorders are all part of this octopus where underpinned by reward deficit state. You can see all of us lie on a spectrum. You'll see ventral to dorsal shift. You see, in the early phases, there are goal-directed behaviors, which basically means that the prefrontal cortex is still having some control over this system. It's still goal-directed, but it's this shift from the dorsomedial striatum to the dorsolateral striatum, the habit part, i.e. from the goal-directed to the habit, that really starts creating the issues. Because remember how our structures have evolved. They've evolved to move everything from goal-directed to habit. What's happening here is the substances move along exactly the same way because that's how we've evolved. We've evolved to move from goal-directed to habit. And they're taking the substance behavior along with it. So what we've got here is this happens in the late phase. So what's known as impulsivity to compulsivity happens in eating disorder. That's why it's more resistant to treat, because the prefrontal cortex starts losing its battle and the individual starts operating on a compulsive mode, on a habit mode, on a primitive mode. Let's recap the cascade towards addiction. Starts off with reward learning, correct? The exposure to substance, the unexpected signal, because it's the first time you've used it, you've never been exposed to the substance ever before, there is a surprise signal generated, right? Now, in some individuals, that surprise signal will lead to escalating drug use with the belief that we can control it. The issue here is that we know what we think we can do is often quite different from our behavior. We know that the allostatic load through this escalating drug use has started. It's having its effect on the brain reward pathways. So therefore, we have allostatic load with incentive sensitization. So you remember the incentive sensitization is the process where liking is going down and wanting is going up. Essentially, we're moving towards the process of normal reward learning, where the substance is being associated with the cues, right? Whilst the actual reward is not giving us what we experienced at the start. And number of cues will start being associated. Then, as it continues, the prefrontal cortex will start gradually weakening or losing its battle, simply because it's learned and it's moved towards the habit area. That's known as the ventral-to-dorsal shift. Then comes what's known as the dark side. I'll touch on this dark side a bit later. This then moves towards a learned association, because this dark side is where negative responses are removed by the drug. Therefore, there's a learned association that this drug helps me, or it removes the negative aspects. Then we move towards cues and seeking, cues and relapse, and then cue generalization. Lots of other cues will start getting added on, and you can see how this process can continue.